It's early morning in Seoul. You're on the KTX to Busan. People are still settling into their seats. The conductor is moving down the aisle, and for the moment, the whole thing still looks routine, until a woman comes stumbling onto the train at the last second. She's injured, shaking, and clearly not well, but somehow she still slips through the door before anyone can stop her. At this moment, the trip stops being a normal ride to Busan and starts turning into something else entirely. In most outbreak media, people die waiting in place. They hold on to a building, a neighborhood, and the idea that somebody official is going to show up and explain what's happening before things get worse. They keep holding on to that idea right up until the moment they finally try to leave, only to find out the roads have already been clogged for hours. But Train to Busan doesn't give us that same old story. Less than 15 minutes into the movie, we're already in motion, heading south on the fastest rail line in the country. And the question the whole film keeps circling back to is whether being on the train actually saved anyone or just locked them inside a decision they couldn't take back. So today we're gonna drop you into Seoul as a regular person and break down your actual escape windows. We'll look at the warning signs you could have acted on before the city panicked, why public transit becomes a fatal trap, and whether you could actually survive an outbreak when your only route is a high-speed steel tube you have no control over. Now before we jump into the timeline, we need to take a closer look at the train, because being on the KTX sounds exactly like what you'd want during an active outbreak. It's fast enough to skip the gridlock entirely, and you've already got a destination locked in before most people have even figured out which highway to take. Going from Seoul to Busan in a little over 2 hours sounds almost unfair compared to slumming it down a highway with no guarantee that the road won't lock up on you. But once you realize you're stuck inside of a narrow steel tube with fixed doors, fixed stops, and almost no room to improvise, things start to look a little bit different. Because the aisles in this train are already tight even when everybody's calm. And the second people start shoving past each other, dropping bags, freezing in place, or trying to squeeze through at the same time, the aisles stop being a walkway and start clogging with bodies. And the doors between cars might look like barriers, but in practice, they're just points where one compartment spills into the next. If the infected are in a car behind you, that glass door is the only thing separating them from your group. In a train, you don't have floors to climb either. You don't have side rooms to duck into. You have one line running forward and back, and every time another car gets overwhelmed by the infected, the amount of train you can safely access gets shorter and shorter. And then the railroad starts making things worse. If you're in a car on a highway and bad information comes in, you can still do something useful with it. You can pull off, reverse, or abandon the vehicle and cut through somewhere else. On this train, every new piece of bad news just sits on your lap while the train keeps carrying you towards the next scheduled stop. And that's what boarding the train costs you. You get speed, but from that point on, where you go and where you stop is no longer up to you. Now, this movie gives you hints in small pieces about what's going on, but none of them are clear enough to make a normal person want to pack up and leave. For example, the movie kicks off with a truck driver entering a quarantine checkpoint, where he's told there's been a minor leak in the biotech district. Shortly after, the same truck hits a deer on the road. As he drives off, it stands back up in a way that doesn't quite make any biological sense. But you'd have to be standing right there to see it, and even then, your brain would likely pull some kind of mental gymnastics to make sense of it. And then we see a convoy of emergency vehicles potentially rushing towards a burning building first thing in the morning. Individually, none of these would cause any real panic, except for the deer. That was kind of mental, for being honest here. That's the state Seoul is in when people start arriving into the station. The city isn't visibly in chaos yet. The trains are still running, departures are still being posted on the board, and because nothing is out of the ordinary, people go about their business like it's just a regular day. Alright, so that was the timeline leading up to the escape windows. Now let's figure out when you actually had a chance to leave. The first window opens before most people realize they had to take it. This is the phase where the warning signs are still scattered. Maybe you hear about the leak, maybe you catch a strange report on the news, maybe something about the mood in the city feels a little bit off, but not enough to justify dropping everything and heading south on instinct alone. So what does leaving during this window actually look like? It looks like you acting before Seoul Station ever becomes part of your escape plan, before you hand over your ability to choose where to stop to a train that's already decided where it's going. It looks like you getting in your car early, picking a direction away from Seoul, and moving towards it while the traffic is still normal. At this point, gas stations would still be open. Stores would still be stocked. Nothing around you would look out of the norm enough to confirm, which technically is exactly what you want, but also why almost nobody would have taken this window. Because not only is this window tough to see, but if you left here, you're leaving based on weird news reports and a gut feeling you can't quite explain to anyone. And if it turns out to be nothing, you'll be known as the person who packed up their life and hightailed it out of town for absolutely no reason. But if you end up being right, this is the last exit where where you're still in control of your fate. You've got your own vehicle, you control your route, and you get to decide whether Busan is even the right destination in the first place. But again, almost nobody moves during this phase. Reality is most people need absolute certainty, and by the time they get it, they'd be joining the crowds at the station. And if you've seen the movie, we all know what direction this is heading in. Alright, so window 2, this is the window most people would actually take. It's morning, you're at Seoul Station, the platform is active, departures are still being posted, and from where you're standing, nothing looks out of the norm. The KTX to Busan is running on schedule, people are boarding normally, and nothing in front of you looks alarming enough to change your mind. From where you're standing, there is still no obvious reason not to get on. The KTX gets you to Seoul quickly, and it takes you south before most people have a clear picture of how bad the outbreak really is. The problem is what you give up the second those doors close. Your movement isn't yours anymore. The train decides where you stop, who's sealed in with you, and how long you're stuck in the train between there and Busan. And the movie makes this point almost immediately. The departure itself is smooth. People settle in their seats, the conductor moves through the aisle, and the train pulls out of Seoul like any other morning. Then just before the doors close, that woman I mentioned earlier stumbles aboard and collapses out of sight. And that's the point where this stops being a potentially safe way out. So boarding the KTX wasn't a real escape window. It was the last bad bet that still looked reasonable from the platform. The second the train leaves Seoul, with the infection already on board, your survival depends on a route you no longer control, and stations that may already be failing before you reach them. So at this point, the only real escape window is now behind you. But for a stretch of time after departure, everything around you is still telling you that you made the right call. People are in their seats, the crew is moving through the cars, and the countryside is sliding past the window. If you're one of the passengers farther from the infected woman who boarded, count your blessings, because you're in a better position than the passengers on the other side of the train. Unfortunately, that doesn't last very long, because the infected woman who boarded the train tucked herself away in a bathroom where she's already been slowly turning. Meanwhile, train attendants catch wind of someone strange who boarded, so they head over there to investigate. They knock on the door only to find a homeless man repeating, "They're all dead." Again, this wouldn't set off any alarms yet. It could easily be brushed off as a homeless man who snuck onto the train. But shortly after that, the infected woman staggers down an aisle and collapses on the floor. One of the train attendants finds her convulsing. She calls for help, and the lady starts popping and locking behind her before biting the attendant. The attendant is then seen walking up the aisle with the infected lady latched to her back, where she inevitably dies and turns. From there, the infection rips through the rear cars almost immediately. Fortunately, the KTX is long enough that you don't see anything happening right away, but you hear commotion, catch a few people running between carriages, so you walk down there to check things out. And by the time you see it for yourself, the only direction left to go is back towards the front. You and the remaining passengers manage to fight your way forward, slam the door shut behind you, and stand there watching through the glass as the infected passengers try to get to you. And this is where the KTX becomes worse than the city you left. Seoul was dangerous, but a city still gives you room to break contact. The moment the infection boards this train, you're basically shit out of luck. Three things are now locked together in the same narrow moving tube: the outbreak, the survivors trying to contain it, and the route carrying all of them forward at the same speed. This is one of the only times I would say a city is a better place to be during an active outbreak. But realistically, you're just going for the less shit option, because they both suck if we're being honest here. But even after fighting your way forward, there's still one thing keeping hope alive. And that's Daejeon, because the train crew announced that the military has secured the station. Soku even got a phone call confirming a military quarantine is waiting for them. So when the train pulls in, Daejeon does not feel like a random stop. In an outbreak, places like this pull people in. You hear there's military screening on a platform and some kind of organized handoff waiting for you. And on paper, that sounds safer than staying trapped on a train with infected passengers behind glass. Unfortunately, the door opens. You step off expecting a controlled transfer, but instead you're greeted by absolute silence. There are no soldiers directing people, no staff organizing lines, and no signs that anybody here is actually in charge. Then the soldiers finally appear, and a second later, you realize they're already infected. Basically, Daejeon looks safer because it had the shape of authority around it. The military, a quarantine, containment, but the second you step into it, you find out the people who were supposed to stabilize the station were consumed by the same collapse everyone else was. So everybody turns and runs into a blind panic for the train they just got off of. The survivors get get split. Some make it into the safe front car, but you end up on the wrong side of that split, stranded several compartments back. A few minutes ago, the people you needed to reach were right next to you. Now, they're 4 cars ahead, and every glass door between you and them is packed with infected. From here on out, survival has nothing to do with waiting for the next official solution. Staying alive comes down entirely to whether you can physically force your way through the infected cars before the train finishes swallowing you two. Now before we move on, the passengers stopping at Daejeon is what I call an authority trap. People move toward it trusting the uniforms and checkpoints. What nobody accounted for was how fast the military perimeter turns into a feeding ground when the soldiers holding it start turning. This is why you don't move towards quarantine zones. Not blindly at least. They're only as safe as the people holding them. And the moment someone inside turns, you've got a massive crowd with nowhere to go, standing next to an outbreak they walked into voluntarily. Alright, everything I laid out about the KTX at the start of the video pointed to the same problem every time, and that's the fact that you have one path to go forward and back. You have no side roads branching off, and no floors to climb to buy distance. So once the group gets split, all of that stops being background details and starts to turn into the thing deciding whether you'll live or die. Because now that you're split, the only way to get to the other people is to move forward through the train. And that's exactly what the movie turns into next. You and all the main characters are stranded behind the others, and the remaining survivors are several cars ahead. So everyone wraps their forearms, grabs whatever they can use as a weapon, and start pushing forward. But this is where the layout of the train starts to become a nightmare for you. In tactical terms, what you're looking at here is called a fatal funnel, a confined space with zero lateral movement where you're forced into a linear meat grinder. In a normal urban survival scenario, if a path is blocked, you try another route, easy peasy. You cut down a side street, duck into a building, or back off entirely. On the KTX, you're trapped inside a straight line of compartments where every blocked car has to be taken head-on. The doors all have to be opened manually, the infected have to be dealt with at arm's length, and each compartment costs you energy and injuries just to gain a few more feet. But the tunnels are the one break you get. In the dark, the infected lose visual contact and stop moving until the lights come back. So every tunnel becomes a tiny tactical window where you hold your breath, move as far as you can, and hope the train doesn't clear the tunnel before you've made it to the next door. And outside those tunnels, every car forward requires you to fight for your life. Sanghua ends up forfeiting his own, so the people behind him can make it through the next door. After fighting your way through the infected compartments, you'd think reaching the front section would finally mean something. Now, this is the point where the infected stop being the only threat on the train. Once safe space starts shrinking, panic and fear change what people are willing to do in a survival situation. I sometimes get comments saying we wouldn't turn on each other that fast. But context matters, and in this situation, people would stop trying to help each other and start sacrificing others to protect the little bit of safety they still have left. And in Train to Busan, we see the character Yeon-suk do just that, because he starts turning the room before the survivors from the back make it up front. By the time you and the others reach the door, the passengers in the safe car are already holding it shut. Up to that point, the train was killing people through infected bodies moving through narrow aisles. But now the passengers themselves are trying to do the same thing. So out of curiosity, if you were in the front side of the train, do you think you would have done the same thing? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious how many sick bastards I have watching this video. Kidding, of course. I probably would have done the same thing myself after seeing how fast the infection was actually tearing through everybody. Anyway, that decision catches up with them, because once a safe space starts shrinking, panic turns everything into a sum-zero problem. If letting you in might get me killed, then you stay out. That's the kind of survival math people start doing when they're watching infected bodies pile up against the glass. But that logic doesn't save them either. The people from the back still make it to the front section. And then an older woman who watched her sister die in the chaos decides to open the door and lets the infected pour into the safe car. That's the other side of collapse psychology. Once a group decides other people are disposable, it shouldn't be surprising when somebody stops caring whether that group survives either. After that, every section of the train has been breached, and whatever illusion of a protected compartment still exists is gone. The survivors who are left cling to whatever space they can find, and the KTX keeps pushing south. By this point, the movie has already shown you that a train is only as useful as the line ahead of it. Speed means absolutely nothing once the infrastructure carrying it starts to fail. And even after all that, the train still doesn't go straight to Busan. It ends up getting stopped again at East Daegu because the track ahead is blocked. And this is the ultimate weakness of rail evacuation. A high-speed train can cover huge distances quickly, but only as long as the line ahead of it still works. The second the track is blocked, all the speed stops mattering. Your route is dead and the train turns into deadweight. And that's exactly what happens at East Daegu. And then another announcement comes over the train telling any survivor that the KTX can't continue forward, that the rescue team may be coming, and that anyone still alive should transfer to a working train on the far left track. So even after everything you've already been through, you're forced off the train and into a rail yard, looking for another locomotive that may or may not still get you south. That transition is its own danger. The moment you leave the train, you lose the last bit of cover, structure, and momentum the KTX was still giving you. Now you're on foot, out in the open, moving through wreckage with no controlled perimeter around you. By now, the group has been reduced to a few survivors, and East Daegu is just as unforgiving as the rest of the movie has already been. You and the last survivors push through the rail yard and climb over abandoned train cars, trying to reach the only working engine left. Yeon-suk keeps doing what he's done all through the back half of the movie, buying a few more seconds for himself by sacrificing anybody near him. At this point, survival is no longer being decided by who moved early or who picked the right destination. It comes down to whether people at the end of the line can still tell the difference between a survivor and a threat. By the final stretch, the only thing left to find out is whether one last working piece of the machine can carry anybody to Busan alive. You and the other survivors reach the locomotive, but Yeon-suk is already infected by then, and Soku gets bitten dealing with him. And that is unfortunately the end of Soku, even if he stays on his feet a little longer. He gets the engine moving south, buys enough time for you and the others to stay alive, and then throws himself from the train before he turns. So the final run to Busan belongs to you, a child, and a pregnant woman, alone in the last functioning part of the KTX. But even then, the movie still has one more failure left to show you. When you reach the tunnel approach into Busan, military snipers are waiting. From a distance, the soldiers don't see survivors, they see figures stepping out of an active infection zone. At that range, whether you get rescued or shot comes down to whether you can prove you're human before somebody squeezes the trigger. The only reason you're not shot is because the little girl you're with starts crying and singing. Now let that sit for a second. After outlasting the initial outbreak, the fatal funnel of the train cars, the collapse of the military quarantine, and that blockade rail infrastructure, your survival still ultimately came down to a coin toss at the end of a sniper rifle. Had this been The Last of Us, you very likely would have been chewing on lead. And that is how things finally come to an end. The survivors get through because they outlasted every single piece of the system that was supposed to help them. From the handoff at Daejeon, fighting your way through the train, and all the way through the block track at East Daegu. A lot of zombie media punish you for staying put for too long. Train to Busan does something different. Here you move during what seemed early but still get punished. And even after reaching Busan, you still almost die because the people waiting there can't tell survivors from infected. By the time it was all said and done, it wasn't just the infected killing people. Alright, so let's wrap this thing up. When did you actually have a chance to leave? The only real escape window was before Seoul Station ever became part of your day. That was the point where you were still in charge of your own fate. The invisible window, as I like to call it. Usually in this series I've been doing, there have been more than one escape window, but not in Train to Busan. Once you boarded the KTX, your fate was out of your hands, and survival stopped being about smart planning and came down to brutal close quarters combat and a whole lot of luck. Alright guys, if you made it to the end, I appreciate that as always, and YouTube thinks you'll like this video. If you've already seen it, I've got a playlist of a lot more just like it. Till next time guys, cheers.